excited about this. So this panel is going to be, Ian's panel earlier was looking at the DCP process. We're going to be looking out further ahead, sort of the future beyond DCP. We'll get into the details of that in just a minute. And at our panel, the panelists, as you'll hear in just a sec, they've been a little bit elevated above the gore of the DCP process itself. So hopefully we can provide a little bit of a 30,000-foot view of what's out there and what comes next. Introductions. Pat, I'll start with you. Most people probably know Pat already. Currently with Brookings Institution and the Boyd School of Law at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Better known for her 25 years as the head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority in Las Vegas. Pat has been a very forceful voice and a real force for change in river politics over that 25 years. Jennifer Pitt has spent about 20 years currently with Audubon, but before that with Environmental Defense Fund, working really closely on Colorado River issues, kind of from the environmental NGO perspective. Jennifer has been very, very closely involved in the restoration flows for the Mexican Delta, which has been, as many of you know, it's been an ongoing saga in its own right and a real success story. And I think also stands out as being a member of the environmental community who can speak the language of the water managers, can think like a water manager, and has kind of created a new sort of interaction and dialogue that wasn't really possible 20 years ago. Ann Castle is currently a fellow at the Getches-Wilkinson Center at University of Colorado. Before that, she was Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Water and Science. And so her responsibilities, and she oversaw the U.S. Geological Survey, but more importantly for our purposes was also in charge, oversaw the Bureau of Reclamation, and was very, very closely involved in water policy. And then Dave White is the director of the Decision Center for Desert City at ASU here in town. He is an Arizona thinker, as opposed to a fighter, and I think he and his colleagues have been spending a lot of time looking at collaborative decision making on the river, and then also decision making under conditions of uncertainty. And so I think he's got very interesting perspectives from that research to share today. Really brief context. This has come up a couple times over the past day and a half, but I think bears reiterating. When you talk with most water managers on the Colorado River now, they're looking at two big problems, right? And the first, we've talked a lot about the structural deficit in the lower basin, that's 1.2 million acre feet of overuse. And then also over the longer term, some pretty severe reductions in stream flow. Kathy, you talked about this yesterday. Over the century, some of the most recent work that's come out that I think has really gotten a lot of attention within the community of water managers was a paper by Brad Udall and Jonathan Overpeck that's been out for about a year and a half, which basically says conservatively estimating, there's going to be a 20% reduction in stream flow by mid-century, this century, and a 35% reduction in stream flow by the end of the century. So I think this is something that has really gotten people galvanized and thinking about. We talk a lot about the structural deficit, particularly through this DCP process, but there's some even bigger challenges that are out there in the not too distant future. This panel is focused on what comes next after DCP. There's kind of a technical, very specific nexus here, which is that under the terms of the 2007 guidelines, the states are obligated to reopen negotiations no later than the end of next year. And then they have to basically come up with a successor to the 2007 guidelines by 2026. So, these guys have been going full blasts negotiating the DCP, and they're going to have to turn around again in pretty short order and do the successor to the 2007 guidelines. For the purposes of the panel, I think we'll be talking a little bit in terms of what that might look like, but also beyond that, I mean, out to the end of the century. What are the things that we need to be talking about? So I think I've kind of put 3 fairly broad questions to the panelists, and I think we're going to end up taking this in bits and pieces. But basically, what comes next? So, what are the broad outlines of a more comprehensive effort to tackle these 2 problems, the structural deficit and then these climate-driven stream flow reductions? What will that look like? And I think just important, how are we actually going to get there? DCP obviously was a very, very, I was talking with somebody a couple nights ago who was directly involved in DCP negotiations and basically described it as people sustained a lot of brain damage in that process. Like, it was a pretty brutal process. And so I think there's a lot of hope of how can we find a better way to do it in the future. So yeah, what are the broad outlines of that effort to tackle this? How do we get there? What should we be talking about that's off limits, that's been off limits so far? And then particularly for this audience, where should journalists be looking for the next big stories? And I think we're going to be talking a lot in terms of sort of the kind of like underlying issues that are going to be, pushing politics on the river forward over the next, 50 years. But just, as journalists, where can we kind of be looking and thinking to see where these next big stories are going to be coming up? So Dave, I think we'll start with you. And why don't we'll rein it in a little bit at the start and just like in terms of a bigger, more comprehensive plan for tackling these issues, what do you sort of see the broad outlines as?
Well, thanks so much, Matt, for the question. Before I start, let me just, again, in the tradition that was set forth, I want to start with a little bit of a personal story, if I might. 2 points. First of all, just a personal thank you to the journalists in the room and for doing the work that you do. I brought my copy of the paper this morning. I've been a 7-day-a-week at-home subscriber for 17 years to the newspaper. It's not my hometown paper, it's New York Times, but I get this paper every single day, read it every single day. And I really appreciate the work that you do, and I appreciate the work that my hometown newspaper, the Arizona Republic, has been doing, in particular with the environment coverage, and thanks to the grant from the Pulliam Trust, so that we have not only Ian, but also Andrew and, her name's going to skip. What's the other fellow's name? Her name is escaping me right now. Priscilla, thank you. And so really appreciate the work, and there couldn't be a more important time for journalism in our country right now, and I know both through disruption to the industry as well as through sustained attacks, it's a difficult time, and just personally say thank you for what you're doing. Second, quickly, my work on the Colorado River started just about 20 years ago as a doctoral student when I had the privilege to work on the Colorado River and was able to raft the Grand Canyon. And so I've rafted over 1,500 miles on the Grand Canyon and, wow. Spent 4 months basically living on the river, working on the Department of Interior, National Park Service's Colorado River Management Plan back in the late 90s, which ultimately led to a major revision in the plan in the early 2000s. So my interest in the Colorado is really personal, and it was, I think being on the river and seeing the river and developing that personal connection is so important to the work that we do, and I think that's another reason that journalism is so important, because it really brings that personal connection to people. So just want to say those 2 things quickly, and then as far as what comes next, I think the most important thing, I think, from the DCP process for what comes next was Governor Lewis referred to this, and that was the transition from the early stages of the DCP, we'll say in 2016, into where the DCP process, and I'm focused predominantly on Arizona here, where that process ended up. And the improvements that were made, and I'll definitely address some of my perceptions about the shortcomings, but the improvements that were made in terms of inclusivity, transparency, and collaboration. And so the creation of social capital and the architecture to move forward was perhaps the most important outcome of the DCP, as opposed to the various technical elements of how water will be stored within the lake and how we avert the shortage declaration on the river. And I think that's the piece that we need to build upon, and we need to learn very quickly and move much more quickly in the next stages.
Yeah, anyone who feels...
Yeah, I'll build on what Dave has said. The current guidelines expire at the end of 2025. That's 6.5 years from now. We heard from Terry that the DCP process to this day has been 5 3/4 years. So we have to start immediately. And I think that one of the best ways to achieve the kind of inclusivity and that we've heard talked about and to hear from the voices of all of the stakeholders is through an EIS process, through the NEPA process. That was done with the 2007 guidelines. It wasn't done with the DCP. And there's good reasons for that. But we have the time and the opportunity to use the EIS process. And through the scoping of that EIS, kind of define what we're doing. And we can define that in terms of, we're after a sustainability plan, which Sandy referred to earlier, and I totally agree with. I think that's what we should be striving for. And I also think that we have to recognize that we've got different limits than we thought we had in 1922 and in 2007. And if our goals are to operate within those limits and to end up with sustainability, then that will define a good process going forward. And the NEPA process ensures a lot of robust public and stakeholder participation. But I'm going to caveat that and say that I think it's also essential that we leave room in that process for small, closed-door meetings among the state representatives and the Department of the Interior, because there are things that need to get done in this next version of operating guidelines that elected and appointed officials can't do in public. And that's just the fact, in my view, that there will need to be compromises, there will need to be creative solutions, that it would be political suicide to take those positions in public. They have to be vetted in private, and that's the only way it's going to happen. And I know there's a tension there between listening to the voices of the stakeholders who deserve to be listened to, but allowing the space for those closed-door discussions. But somehow I think they've both got to happen.
And can I just jump in really quick? Do you have an example that you've seen in past negotiations, just to give, because this can be a little bit abstract sometimes, I think, something that you can talk about now, that sort of process of compromise that had to happen behind a closed door?
Well, Pat and others can speak to this as well. But, the way the DCP process started after Secretary Jewell in 2013 said, solve this problem or I will, the states and the major stakeholders started what they called the out-of-the-box process, OTB. And that was a fairly limited discussion in terms of the people involved, but everything was on the table. things that had been third rail issues, things like allocating evaporation in Lake Mead among the lower basin states, things like taking the Mexican delivery obligation out of the lower basin allocation, and a host of other things. That could only happen in a small group discussion. And those are the things I think we need to be thinking about again now, because we have the opportunity, we have the space to do that creative thinking now at the beginning of the process, and then to narrow the scope as this goes on. And if I can just say one more thing, I sort of get revved up about this stuff. But this window of opportunity that we have now is not going to last until 2026. The major components of the DCP, interstate components, have been locked down for 4 years. They haven't changed. And so we've got a couple of years right now, I think, to do a lot of creative thinking and kind of change our paradigm. And then things are going to start getting locked into place, and we'll be able to tweak around the edges, but I'm thinking that major changes won't happen as we get closer to 2026.
Cool. Jennifer, you want to?
Sure. I don't disagree with anything that I've heard, but I guess I would add to it and say that the creative ideas aren't only going to come from that small room of states putting their heads together. And I have lived through the success of having defined a problem and a solution in a way that water managers, not only from the 7 states, but from both countries, were able ultimately to live with. And so I guess I've been thinking about how we bring these voices in and the role that you all as journalists have to play here. I think it's incumbent on us not to simply look to the state leaders for that leadership, but to understand that that leadership has to come from a much broader set of stakeholders. And the example that Mike brought up earlier of the conservation groups bringing alternatives to the NEPA processes, that didn't just happen at the last minute. That's the product of years of analyses and thoughtful conversation, and frankly help from the Bureau of Reclamation with some of the technical aspects of developing both the surplus proposal that Mike referenced, but also the conservation before shortage proposal that we put together for the 2007 guidelines. So I've been doing some thinking about how these many conversations that are already emerging about how tribes can play a role, about how we can end up with healthy rivers in this basin, as well as thriving urban and rural economies. How can we inject the conversation with some of these ideas that frankly can be taboo for the political leaders to mention? Part of what we have to do, and I would argue you journalists have to help us do, is to help move a broader public understanding of the issues so that some of those taboo issues aren't so taboo anymore. I mean, it's verboten to store water in Lake Mead until it's not, and it's forbidden to have water transfers until it's not. So when is it going to be time to have interstate transfers? We already have interstate trades, interstate deals. When are we going to have interstate transfers? When are we going to think like a full basin, thinking upper basin and lower basin and Mexico, and thinking about more integration there? I submit that, that all of that can be on the table, but we asking the 7 states to do that by themselves is an impossible task for them. And what we need to do is build the dialogue, build a public understanding. And I don't mean that everyone on the street's going to get it, because we've tried that and it's clearly not going to happen, but to broaden the conversation. And I'm heartened by a conference like this, by so much more activity. 20 years ago, there was nothing like this, or even in 2007 towards those guidelines, nothing like the level of attention being paid to the issues. So I'm optimistic on the one hand, and on the other hand, I look at 5 years of brain damage, blood, sweat, and tears for the DCP, and I absolutely, the DCP, I support its adoption. I do think avoiding those catastrophic shortages is fundamentally important, but I wish it had been able to do more.
And before you jump in, just really quickly, Jennifer, when we were talking about this in preparation, you had mentioned, I had asked you about taboos that had already been broken or lines that had been crossed, and you had 2, I thought, pretty instructive examples. I think like when you're covering this day to day, you can sometimes tend to forget like the big steps that have been made. So can you just talk to that
some of
briefly?
them, these are not necessarily in order, but we have addressed environmental flows, not just to the Colorado River Delta in minutes 319 and 323, but also to the Cienega, as Commissioner Salmon mentioned, in 318, temporary, but it has been done. Transfers, which, I stand on the shoulders of some great thinkers at Environmental Defense Fund who aren't there anymore, but they were publishing papers just trying to argue that water transfers made any sense, and that idea was verboten, and now we see it as a part of doing business in the Colorado River Basin. Again, I mentioned banking and interstate transfers, and I'd say that we now have some precedents as well for off-reservation storage of tribal water rights, as well as tribal ICS, which is something that DCP is going to bring into existence for the first time. So all things that were taboo that now are like, these are the tools that we need. And I don't have the magic recipe for how you get from here to there, but I think we have to keep in mind that that kind of progress is possible. And we all do a good job sometimes of shunning ideas that we decide need to be shunned, like as the collective Colorado River Brain Trust. But we have to be thoughtful about how we do that, and cognizant of the fact that every idea may eventually get its time. Maybe not everyone, but many ideas may eventually get their time.
Well, I too want to say thank you to all of you in the Third Estate who have so patiently put up with all of us water geeks for as long as you've been reporting on water issues. And I was very much taken by listening to the panel that just preceded us, because I think if there's a takeaway that is really important, especially as we move forward, and Jennifer said she was standing on the shoulders of those that came before her. As one of the old curmudgeons around this river, I know how it all began. And there, for example, one man has not gotten, as far as I'm concerned, the level of recognition that he deserved, because none of this would ever have happened had Bruce Babbitt not stepped in the 90s and said, this nonsense is over, we're going to change, and corralled cats for 8 solid years. We argued about the shape of the table. We argued who was going to sit at the table, how many representatives each state could have. His tenacity, his dedication, and his passion around making it happen are the shoulders that we're standing on today. I think it's fabulous that we're actually sitting here in the lower basin and recognizing that we have a structural deficit. When Jim Lockhead first made us take a look at structural deficit, we all looked at him like, okay, you can go home now. We don't want to even have this conversation. We've come a long way. But I'm going to push back a little on what Ann said. I don't think the EIS process, which I know no matter what we do, we're going to have to go through it. But it's clumsy, and it's been weaponized, and there's a better process. For the longest time now, at least 2 decades, urban areas have used an integrated resource planning process. In my mind, that would be a far more productive way to move forward, because it forces you to look at all the options, it forces you to look at all the resources, it forces you to look at what, if any, facilities need to be built, what the costs are. It includes all the groups that are affected, and it has the inherent objective to coming up with a goal. There are some really serious issues that the next 7 years have to address, or there won't be a continuation or the next chapter of the 2007 agreement. The structural deficit has to be addressed. Period. End of conversation. We can't go on the way we are. If you think about how does the lower basin absorb the structural deficit and the impacts of climate change? Are we really going to sit here as the lower basin and say, well, we're going to work on the premise that our upper basin neighbors are never going to develop their supply? Let's be honest, that's what we've been saying. That's what we've been thinking is going to keep this all whole. It's not logical. It's not a safe assumption. It's not logical. We can't continue to work from that premise. What caused the structural deficit? There's any number of culprits that help cause the structural deficit. And I'm not going to point the finger at any one of them. But the time to take it on is going to be in the next 7 years. Now, are we going to do that by finding our next most convenient villain? For the longest time, it was ag, more particularly IID. They make a great villain. They kind of set themselves up to be the target. Some of it's self-inflicted pain, but they set themselves up to be the target. We can't afford to have a war between urban and ag. We can't afford to start doing trade-offs that are never, ever, ever going to be possible. They're not politically possible. They're not realistically possible. The tribes have to be a part of the conversation. Mexico has to be a part of the conversation. Everything has to be integrated. But we also have to put augmentation on the table. A dwindling supply, a structural deficit. How do we add to the system? There are 40 million people in this basin. Some of the nation's most valuable national parks, tribal nations, valuable agriculture. We can't get through this next 7 years simply by taking away. Yes, trades and exchanges and reuse and storm capture and all those smaller urban regional discussions absolutely are part of the equation. There isn't one silver bullet. If we have to fix the structural deficit, the other thing we have to do is we have to address 3 environmental issues. At a minimum, the Salton Sea, the Cienega de Santa Clara, and the Delta. Those squarely have to be on the table. None of the solutions, look, the sea is dwindling every single year because of the QSA. The air quality in Palm Springs is getting worse and worse. In California now, for some time, they have been talking about a sea-to-sea solution. The sea-to-sea solution is, I just heard you take a deep breath. I heard it. But just like you said, the unthinkable has to be on the table. The unthinkable has to be on the table. Now add to that the sea-to-sea solution, the notion that there is enough geothermal in the Imperial Valley to desalt 1 million to 1.5 million acre feet. Combine those thoughts and start thinking. What if the Salton Sea was stabilized at ocean level quality? What if you had some form of an outflow and it was biologically possible to send some of that water through the delta, stabilize the Cienega to Santa Clara? And what if you desalted 1 million and 1 million or 1.5 million acre feet and let IID use that water and leave behind 1 million and 1 million to 1.5 million acre feet in Lake Mead? You've just addressed the structural deficit. Now you have the resilience to deal with the ever deteriorating climate implications that this basin is going to face. I can see in everyone's face, 16 people are going, oh my God, it's going to cost money. Look, for 5 minutes, think about this. Let's see, we tweaked a couple of federal budgets and found $8.7 billion to build a flipping wall. How much do we spend every single year on roads? To build more roads. And interestingly enough, in the legislation the United States Senate passed in 1944, in which it adopted the treaty with Mexico, there's a little clause in which the United States Congress commits to the 7 states they will replace the 1.5 million acre feet. Where is it? It's an outstanding obligation. It is something it is time to take a look at. If you can stabilize the Salton Sea, because we're all tethered to the Salton Sea, nothing can happen on that river, whether it's exchanges, whether it's conservation, that doesn't somehow ultimately affect the Salton Sea. And then the dominoes start falling. The environmental degradation increases, the air quality in Palm Springs gets worse. What if? If we are going to go through a planning process, then really everything has to be on the table. Everything. Conservation is foundational. That's a given. But at what point does conservation no longer is it able to answer the entire question? And that's what the next 7 years are going to cause us to confront.
If I may. I have nothing against the concept of augmentation. In the basin study, there was a modeling concept that we relied on called miracle water. And if I'm serious, that's what we called it in the official model. And if we could have some miracle water, I'm down with it, because as Pat pointed out, we have real environmental water needs, and as urban and ag struggle to meet their own needs, the solution can't be to continue to go conserve water out of nowhere, which really means to further deplete our environmental water supplies. However, I am concerned about what someone, I think Paolo last night, called the magical thinking of silver bullet solutions, and that becomes a distraction from hard work that is, millions of nickel-sized projects all over the place that are going to get us there. So I am not an expert on the C2C pipeline, but I do know some people who are and got some facts to share with you, including the fact that to desal 1 million acre-feet a year through a C2C pipeline, you would end up with 40 million tons of salt, just dry salt every year. That's enough every year to bury 6 square miles in 3 feet of salt. And if you wanted to move it out of the Imperial Valley, you'd need to be using a 100-car rail every day to move the salt out of the area. And I looked up the weight capacity of trucks, like big trucks last night. It's 5,000 trucks a day to move the salt. So I'm concerned that it doesn't add up. And I would love for Pat to go hire the engineers to find the solution.
It's been drawn.
Until we can define what that solution is and talk about it in clear terms that make sense, I am concerned that the silver bullet ideas distract us from the hard work that we have to do. That is not the big, sexy project, but like I said, 1 million nickel-sized projects.
1 million nickel-sized projects aren't going to get us there. They're just not. They are not going to get us there because they're not going to address the structural deficit. The nickel-sized projects are going to be there to make each one of the areas resilient to the climate change impacts that they're going to have to weather through. They're not going to address the structural deficit. And they're not going to help the environmental water. Now, this has been drawn out, and I love your math on your jillion trucks, but, you know, and this is not the silver bullet, because I promise you, simply solving the structural deficit does not in any way, shape, or form address the hydrologic impacts that we're going to see on top of the structural deficit. So let's be pretty clear. 1 million little nickel and dime projects aren't going to get us there. They're just not.
And why don't, we're going to open it up for questions in about 10 minutes. So if anybody wants to get into the nitty-gritty of a desalter and IID, why don't we do it then? Feel free to come on up. But let's keep this discussion going for about 10 more minutes. There's a lot of other stuff we can cover, partly process-wise too. And I'm just to butt in for a second. I mean, Ann, I think there's been a lot of criticism of the DCP process, right, for not being, you know, some people characterize it as not being very open, not having much public participation. It is not subject to a separate NEPA review. As a journalist, like, I love, you know, it makes sense that it should go, any of these agreements should go through NEPA. But this whole idea of people have been working basically nonstop for the past 5.5 years to get across the finish line on DCP. Is there any way that you can open it up that much to bigger thinking, whether it's through a NEPA process or not, just to sort of, you know, let's think big, but on as basically a 6-year timeline, right? Or what would it take? What would you have to change about the dynamic to open that up?
Well, I think it's absolutely possible. And I agree with Jennifer that that we need to get ideas on the table so that ultimately those ideas can be modeled, they can be vetted through a whole different spectrum of stakeholders and cranked into the thinking that ultimately results in an agreement. So, and Pat, I understand the value of the integrated water resources process, but I think that can be incorporated into the NEPA process, which is going to have to occur anyhow, right? This is major federal action. We're going to have NEPA. So I think all of that can work. We need to be thinking about how we remove the disincentives for conservation that exist in the existing structure. We've come a long way toward doing that with the improvements to ICS and the upper basin demand management storage that are part of the DCP. But we've still got use it or lose it mentality baked into the system in various different places. And we have to figure out how to get rid of that. I think there are operational things that we can do to make more water. You don't actually make more water, but you can create additional flexibility to get the water to where it's most needed. And for that, I'd point to the drought operations of the upper basin reservoirs that's part of the DCP. All we're doing there is moving water around when we need to move water around to make sure Powell doesn't go below critical levels. But that substantially reduces the risk of shortage in the upper basin and curtailment of water rights in the upper basin. Well, if we can do that with the upper basin reservoirs, what if we thought of the whole system as one system and figured out what flexibility we could get if we operated all the reservoirs together? That's been anathema. That's been a third rail because you're trading, possession is 9/10 of the law for accounting. But I think we've learned a lot over the past 15 years about how we can account and do it honestly and make sure that if there's an upper basin or a lower basin account in Lake Powell, that water's going to be there when the lower basin needs it. So I think there are things we can do there.
So who makes the decision who needs the water the most? You said we can look at the system and decide where the water needs to go based on who needs the water the most. Who's going to make that decision?
So
who's going to come home to their state and say, well, I decided we didn't need the water?
So what I'm saying is that if we look at the system as a whole, and I don't know that this is true, but it may be true that if we operate all the reservoirs together, we can make more water available to all of the stakeholders, just like the drought response operations are doing those kinds of things in the upper basin, or we expect them to. We can create the same underlying rules. I'm not saying throw out all the rules, but what can we do if we have a more integrated system?
Take what Jim said earlier today. If we take the hydrology that started in 2002 and we start with the health of the system with all its reservoirs, the way it sits today, and you go 3 years, you can manage around this system all you want. It's going to crash. We don't have the resiliency in the system anymore. I mean, it's not as if Fontanelle, Flaming Gorge, Navajo were up to the brim full, or that they have the same storage capacity that a Powell and a Meade has. So when Meade and Powell are at 40%, and all you have to do is go 3 years and replicate that hydrology that we've already lived through once, and you hit a wall, isn't it time to start thinking differently? And not just keep saying we can conserve our way out of it, because it won't happen. If Meade and Powell crash, that means the upper basin is bone dry.
But I think, you've also made the point that it needs to be, you talk a lot about portfolio planning, right? And this idea, there's no silver bullet. You're going to have a cup, it's going to be this mosaic. And I think in the upper basin, right, this whole, the demand reduction, is this the term of art now, the demand reduction program, is kind of a step into that flexibility, right? And that's essentially a conservation program, right? And you're protecting the upper basin. You're paying farmers to forbear use, put water in Powell, essentially as drought protection for the upper basin. Like that's, if you layer these together, you start to get somewhere, right?
Isn't part of the quest for flexibility that today the combination of what our physical infrastructure is and the rules that we use to operate it do not enable voluntary transactions, or at least all the voluntary transactions that might exist. And I think a way to think about, at least the way I think about what Ann is talking about, is by looking at reservoir operations as a whole system, you could come up with flexible rules that don't reallocate water by edict, but rather enable the water users themselves within the bounds of whatever rules and operational, whatever operations we decide are the acceptable operations to operate within that system. Surely it's worth exploring whether examining a more integrated set of reservoir operations could make some progress.
Well, Matt, if I might,
Yeah.
Matt, you mentioned earlier the paper that our colleagues Brad Udall and Jonathan Overpeck wrote and characterized. Within that paper, the envelope was not only that 20% reduction, but especially considering temperature impacts on the upper basin. The projection included an envelope of up to a 50% reduction in stream flow. And if you look at the evidence that came out of the 4th National Climate Assessment, I was a contributing author to that, and Kathy Jacobs, who's here, was the lead, led the third climate assessment. And the 4th climate assessment, both for the Southwest region and the water chapter, include projections, particularly on temperature, that lead us to expect the hydrology that we've seen since 2000, which Pat is mentioning. And so one of the points that I'd like to make is we are moving into an era which climatologists have called a no analog future, right? Meaning there is simply, not even the medieval drought anomaly, there is simply no historical record that approximates what the future will be under the climate change scenarios that we expect. The point that I've been trying to make is that we are entering what I call the no analog policy future. We have no representative historical traditions for dealing with the kinds of problems that we will face in the next 7 to 20 years. Not by mid-century, which has been our tagline for 20 years when talking about climate impacts, that we may see these stream reductions by mid-century, et cetera. These are here now, and we're going to face them over the next 7 to 20 years. And we simply do not have, and I say this with all respect for all of the significant effort that the former Secretary Babbitt and others have put into the process, but the mechanisms that have designed the system to produce the outcomes that we see now cannot be marginally tweaked to produce different outcomes, because the Earth system and the climate system and the water system that we're facing is so fundamentally step change different than what we've seen in the past. And we are nowhere near designing a policy system that is as flexible, innovative, adaptive, and fast moving as we need to address the physical changes that we're seeing.
Right. So great discussion. We need to open the microphone up. If anybody has questions, the lines are open. We'll keep this going, but feel free to come on up and ask questions. So yeah,
just something that occurred to me as you were speaking, which is, we're going to use less water one way or another, right? Because that's what we're going to be handed. So the question is, how do we do it? And that's the question of how our policy system adapts, and the possible losses that you can imagine of a policy system that's not addressing everything we want. I'll leave it to all your imaginations, but I think the thought that we're going to get there one way or another because that's what the water supply is a reality that may help drive some of the policy discussions forward.
Go ahead.
I feel like a scarecrow approaching the great and powerful Oz. So why is it so taboo to suggest that maybe we should grow less hay? I mean, that's what we're doing with all the water in the upper basin. We're growing hay. Colorado's like the lawnmower state. And so why is that a war on ag to grow less hay?
I mean, let me just start by saying two things. One is, if we abandon agricultural use of water in the upper basin, what we're going to see is increased export of water from the Colorado River Basin, which happens mostly away from the river, at the margins, at the watershed boundaries, or through pipelines out far away from the river. And as someone who's dedicated her career to the health of the Colorado River, and 70% of the wildlife in the West that depends on it for some part of their life cycle, I'd hate to see us abandon the health of our rural communities and the uses of water in those places. But I don't disagree with you that Colorado grows a lot of grass one way or another. There's 3 ways you could interpret that today. But I don't, for sure, we're not going to get there with any kind of central edict to do it. That's, I think that is likely off the table. But the innovation of the system conservation program and the offer to, the incentive that is put on the table to offer to irrigators to voluntarily forbear water, and it might not even be giving up the farm. It might just be your late season cutting that gets us, a 25% water use reduction in the upper basin. I don't know. I made up that number. Please don't quote me on it.
And
but,
could I also add to that that we, in this argument to think in terms of broader systems, and after hearing from our partners from Mexico in the last session, we also need to consider the fact that, for example, in central Arizona, as we've seen urbanization replace some prior agricultural production in the central part of the state, through research that we've done using a variety of land use observations and modeling, it's very evident that what we've done is largely export some of our agricultural production to northern Mexico. And we've seen savings inside the basin that come at the cost of groundwater in northern Mexico for food and agricultural products that are shipped both back into the United States and out into the global markets, right? And so just talking about, I think ag is obviously a huge part of the picture, but we hear repeatedly this mantra that we just need to grow less alfalfa or grow less hay, and the consequence is that we grow that stuff somewhere else, often in areas that are more ecologically and socially vulnerable.
Yeah, we can't make ag the villain. I mean, it just started. First question out of the box, why can't we just not grow in Colorado? I mean, we'll never get to the end of the line doing that. I mean, we can't keep looking for the villain. And we keep, yes, we export our crops overseas. And yes, it has a water footprint. And so therefore we're exporting our water out. But for crying out loud, with every cell phone we import from Asia, we're importing Asian water. 1,300 gallons per cell phone battery. Now multiply that by the number of cell phones in this country. I mean, we're moving water across international boundaries everywhere.
And let me just add, too, that we are going to grow less hay, in my opinion. But we need to do that based on a better awareness of what the impacts are. And Dave's research that he spoke about is part of that. We need to understand what those external costs are. Both the secondary impacts of, who's not selling seed and who's not trucking this stuff to the market, but also the ecosystem services. And Jessica talked about that earlier with some new tools that are being developed that will help us better measure what the value of ecosystem services is and we need to consider all of those costs and all of those values when decisions are being made about, okay, we'll just solve our problem with growing less hay. And the very last thing I'll say about that is all the stories that we write, and I'm including myself in this, about agricultural transfers and loss of agriculture, water moving to municipalities. We always talk about food security, and food security is adversely impacted. I have no idea what I mean by that. We have like no measurement of food security and when we're really at risk and when it doesn't matter. And what's the tipping point? And so I think we need some foundational research on what does food security really mean to us in this basin, and when are we crossing the threshold?
The World Economic Forum's done a lot of work on what that tipping point is on food security, because it's not a regional issue, it's a global issue. We now have a global food chain, and that global food chain has lots of points of connectivity. So, yeah, there's been a lot of work done on that.
So I'm going to go back to my question, and at least in this panel, I've heard some material answering.
Tony's going to get this question
I
answered.
still got a question here, which is, Pat, I know when you say you want augmentation, you say conservation is foundational. I know, and nobody wants to get rid of all agriculture, all hay growing. But are we going to have to make some sacrifices to get through the next 7 years, to get through the climate change? And if so, what kind of sacrifices are we going to have to make?
I think Mother Nature is going to handle those sacrifices. And so I think the best we can do in the next 7 years is build a framework that makes us be able to make the least amount of sacrifices, painful sacrifices that we have to, and give ourselves maximum opportunities to be resilient. And that's why I'm going to continue to be a voice. All options have to be on the table. Every single option has to be on the table.
Even I
Any
agree with
further?
that.
All right. Hey.
I knew we always end up agreeing at some place.
I'm going to make water lawyers the villain, but I mean...
Good luck. You're surrounded by them in here.
Am I really? I should have known. I guess my question is, like, it's a little out there, kind of, but, like, the law, everyone's so litigious, and we've been trying, I think, like, the Colorado River community's tried to avoid going to court with the renegotiating the compact or things like that. A big argument against it is just the sort of court cases. And I hear like a big project, like a C2C project, and I just envision like the lawsuits around it, or really a lot of augmentation things, desal, lots of solutions. And like, is that a concern that people are thinking about when they're thinking about different options for the future? And I'm just sort of curious if that's going to play a role in the...
Of course it will, and it doesn't matter what the solution is. If it's too painful, you'll have 27 lawsuits, right?
Right.
I mean...
But do we have time? Like, is there time for
We've
that?
met the enemy, and it is us. I mean, at the end, yes, you always worry about lawsuits.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when we agreed to pay to line the All-American Canal and build the Drop 2 structure, the reservoir down there in the Imperial Valley. I mean, if Senator Reid had not put a clause in federal legislation that said the Secretary of Interior shall line the All-American Canal, we'd still be in court.
Right. I was just curious if the timing of that is kind of factored in.
I mean, I think this is where you sort of get the nexus with challenges to NEPA itself and the ESA, right? Is that there's...
And
I mean,
you
a
can
lot
go
of those
through
are
NEPA and
lesson
still
learned.
someone's going to sue you.
Part of the game.
But I think this basin has prided itself on the fact that we haven't had major litigation in a couple of decades. Not zero, but we've stayed away from major state versus state versus feds litigation. And you see, people are proud of that history. People are proud of our ability to collaborate. You see people start getting nervous, like over the last couple of months when it looked like there was a threat to the viability of the DCP, and people start thinking about litigation, but then we managed to pull it back. And so I think that tension will always exist, but the folks in this room and the folks in this basin are well aware that the decisions that you get with litigation are far inferior to the decisions that you can get by agreement.
And slower.
And they never solve the problem.
Go ahead.
Professor Castle, you said that there were certain things that appointed and elected officials should talk about in private. The original version of the IID deal was massive fallowing. The original version of the DCP, we just heard from Governor Lewis, would have hurt his tribe, and now we're talking about billions of dollars on interstate and international deals. Are these ideas so perfect that they should never be scrutinized before they're done?
I don't think that's what I said. I think that it is essential to have a broad spectrum of voices heard to shape the kinds of arrangements that can be made. But I also think in order to get to the kind of limit-based creative arrangements that we're going to need to deal with the reduced flows in this river basin, you need to give the water leadership some space to talk frankly with people about what they can and can't agree to. And I don't think that can happen in purely public forums.
I want to just make one comment on that, which is I don't disagree with you, but I think there's some collateral damage to those discussions, which is those state leaders just don't have front of mind concerns that tribes do about tribal water issues and environmental representatives do about healthy river issues and other ecosystem issues. And I just would say that's based on my 20 years of watching the river process go by. So there is a flaw to that process.
Yep.
That's why an integrated resource planning process would work so well, because it creates the table for each one of these discussions.
Well, and let me just say, to sort of confirm based on your experience, one of my postdocs and I have been working on studying collaborative governance with a focus on the DCP, but more generally collaborative governance in environmental management issues. And looking across the academic literature, there are a series of sort of principles that have emerged for effective collaborative governance, and sometimes they can be at odds with one another, right? Because one of the key principles is, of course, inclusive and equitable access, right, is necessary to drive collaborative governance. Another, which is sometimes surprising to people, is a perception of harm within action, right? And the premise among the key parties in the collaboration that if they don't do something, that their status quo will change negatively,
Yep.
right? And this is what the critical role is of the Secretary of the Interior and the Bureau, is to change the status quo and make the actors within the process believe that if they don't act, then their status quo could change to the negative. And the literature clearly suggests that there's a need for a balance between open and transparent communication and private transactional communications to occur. Now, of course, striking that right balance is what's so difficult, and that's why I agree. I'll not stand whether it's integrated resource planning. I think you're right. NEPA is going to be the framework that is used, but that's why I agree that you must have a legal and policy framework that sets out the rules of the game and allows people to go through an equitable and transparent way, but that also leaves the space for the social and transactional piece of the puzzle to take place.
Cool. Good.
Hi there. Okay, so I only first heard about the C2C thing today, so I don't want to pretend like I've solved your salt problem. But Los Angeles County did spend more than $300 million building a landfill in Brawley that it can now not use for municipal garbage because it's uneconomical to ship LA trash to Imperial County by rail. But it's only an hour away from the west shore of the Salton Sea. And so there you go. But that's not my point. My question is this. To what extent does MWD's pursuit of the Twin Tunnels project in Northern California reduce the problems of all of the recipients?
I could kiss you. That is a great question. And I think it's one that very few people have written about or understand. You can't solve the Colorado River without solving the Bay Delta.
So did you go ahead and finish? Did you have the last part of the question?
Well, I mean, it isn't a uniformly everybody wants to go do 2 tunnels. I mean, the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, says, let's just do 1 tunnel because we're going to save so much water in LA by being green that we won't need all that water that we could get from the twin tunnels. I truly don't know much about these issues, but I'm interested in your take on the balance of the two.
They're absolutely inextricably interconnected, because when we had the really bad year in 2015, or was it 14? I think it was 15, in a year when the Colorado was going to go down anyway, the Sierras were so bad, Met had to take all of its water out of the bank. So what happens is the delta becomes non-functional, and it puts so much more pressure on the Colorado River. And it starts depleting reservoirs that are already under strain. And you can't blame Met for doing it. I mean, they paid to have the water put in the reservoir. They entered into the agreements in order to create that safety net for themselves. And so, of course, they're going to have to use it, right? Yes, they're inextricably linked.
And I just have to, I think the landfills would be filled up pretty quickly.
All right, go ahead.
There's a business opportunity.
Can we let
Somebody
the
needs to find out
engineers
what to
have
do
this
with that brine.
conversation?
So I've been thinking a lot about what Dave said yesterday about the policymaking apparatus just not having changed, even though everything is changing. Politicians who are responsible for that, they listen to the public, right? And ostensibly the public listens to the media, but I guess we're still in this place where we've withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accords, which is, like, from what I understand, the very bare minimum. So are these, like, I don't know how many people in here report for television, but I don't know. I'm just wondering, is some of this message not even getting to the relevant audience, even when you're talking to a group of journalists that write for papers and radio, Like, who is the audience that's not getting this message at all that we, like, have ended up in this situation?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I think this is, there was this piece many of you probably saw in the New Yorker about the decline in environmental journalism, or at least the perception of a decline, and then there was a very interesting response by the editor here of Arizona Republic in a great 40-tweet thread in response to the New Yorker article. You should definitely read if you get a chance. But I absolutely think that there is a gap between public perception of these issues and public awareness of the issues, and where we are in terms of the reality of the folks who are in the trenches dealing with these issues. I think there's a much greater sense of awareness of urgency, and that has grown. I've been working on these issues only about 15 years, which makes me sort of just barely, like, acceptable to even talk about this stuff. There's a big gulf between where we were just 10 or 15 years ago and where we are now in terms of the awareness of the issue among those who pay attention to it every day. I think the folks who you all try to communicate with in the public are much less aware. And if I could, one thing that we recently did last year, we ran a large public perception survey focused in 3 major cities, the Denver, Phoenix, and Las Vegas metropolitan areas. This was a random sample household level survey to assess public perceptions of the need for change within water systems to address sustainability issues. And the results were, somewhat encouraging, but basically the public perceived somewhat to a great deal of need for change. The greatest perceived need for change coming from residents in Las Vegas, less so in Phoenix and less so in Denver, but all saying that we needed to change to some degree. And the perceptions of some of these solutions, now we focus mostly on conservation-oriented solutions as opposed to some of the augmentation things that Pat has raised, but we found some pretty interesting findings, including about just more than 48% across the whole sample supported direct potable reuse, right? And we even used the words direct wastewater, that we would treat municipal wastewater and deliver directly to residents like you. It's the highest reported number that we've seen in the literature about support for direct potable reuse. We saw very significant, almost 70% support for 25% across the board demand reductions, 3/4 of the sample supporting rainwater harvesting for local irrigation purposes, and the lowest level of support was using only local water to solve your water challenges. So, I think there's some awareness among the public, but I don't think they're caught up yet. And at the 10X meeting last week, we were talking about the fact that a lot of journalists and other folks are still out there talking to people, and water resource managers out there talking to people, and they're still afraid to talk about climate change. Right? And they're still dancing around the issue. It's just, 15 years too late for that kind of behavior.
Let's do this final question, then we're going to need to wrap it up and make room.
I'd like to know what was not in the 2007 agreement that you would like to see in the 2026 agreement.
It doesn't go far enough. It doesn't address the structural deficit. It's a Band-Aid, and there's no other way to call it. It's a Band-Aid. It didn't provide a foundational structure for resilience to be able to weather through climate change. And it is a great beginning. It's quintessential, and I think it was an absolutely critical step in our journey. But I think we've reached the point where the low-hanging fruit, and as difficult as DCP was, it's low-hanging fruit, is we've gone past it. The reservoirs are in such bad shape that we've got to get much more serious on a very different level.
In the Band-Aid, you're talking 2007 guidelines or the
both
and
DCP
also?
yeah.
I guess I'd like to see, as hard as these Band-Aids are to structure, I'd like to see us be even more proactive. I think by setting our conservation agreements in such a way that we really reduce risk across the board, we also have the ancillary opportunity to see more water for our rivers. And so a sort of right size that, and it's going to be, climate change is not stationary, right? Climate change is not one thing, one time, so it's going to have to be a journey, but figuring out how we right size water use in this basin can, I think, we've all said it up here, can be done in ways that address multiple facets of the problems that water can create and the ways that we want to see water used for all of us in the West in the 21st century.
And I would say also that what the 2007 guidelines didn't do is address the structural deficit, and that needs to happen. I disagree with the characterization of either the 2007 guidelines or the DCP as a Band-Aid. I think that they're monumental achievements that states come together and voluntarily agree to significantly reduce their demand, and that we shouldn't trivialize that. They were really hard. But I think there's pretty much universal recognition that they're not enough, that we don't rest here. But you have to go through these stages in order to kind of catch up with that train that's pulling out of the station, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think Anne put it really well as far as my comments as well. I think addressing climate change in the next set of negotiations and trying to just ramp up the speed of our adaptation efforts is really going to be the critical piece. But I do agree. I really do applaud everyone who worked so hard to get this agreement. And while it hasn't solved all of the problems that we're facing, it set us in the right direction and created a mechanism for moving to the next stage of the conversation.
Cool. All right, thank you. I don't think we solved the problem here today, but I think a lot of these issues I feel like they're going to be huge going forward. So thank you for your time.